as a result of numerous deals between China and Indonesia, loosely described as Belt and Road. Indonesia got hold of some Chinese, begins with V, ends in S, don't know if I'm allowed to say it, shots for want of a better word. There was enormous pressure on Indonesians to arrange a shot. Despite these only being available in certain cities, and even then not in abundance. Unlike other medical procedures, these were free of charge and arranged by the local government. But this involved a complicated process of booking and waiting for hours in close proximity to hundreds, maybe even thousands of others, in locations like supermarket car parks, the public areas of malls and underneath road bridges. Call me a cynic, but if this health issue really was so dangerous and transmissible, surely waiting for hours with hundreds of strangers, often pushing to get to the front, was the worst possible response. But then I'm not a public health expert, as numerous health officials, also not public health experts, would remind us cynics. Initially, foreign residents were not permitted to receive these shots. Indeed, a security guard attempted to prevent me from visiting the local supermarket, believing that I was there to secure a shot. But soon the Indonesian government spotted a flaw in their logic, and that this could lead to local people questioning the need for the procedure. And nevertheless, the only shots initially available were those from China, via the deal that I spoke of. Although I was concerned at how quickly all shots had been developed and released for public use. From my limited understanding, the Chinese vaccines were less likely to have negative side effects. Again, I'm completely unqualified to make such an assumption, as were the officials tasked with advising the public. Now, I don't want to be labelled an anti, and I don't think I can say it, but or anti-shotter, shall we say it, even though throughout the period that's exactly what I was called, even by old friends in the UK. Indeed, over the years I've had many shots, including annual fuel shots in the UK. And my problem was that the Chinese shots were not, at least initially, recognised for foreign travel, and especially to the UK. But at first, this was all that was on offer in Indonesia. Strangely, we found that other shots had greater availability in Java than in Jakarta, but we were stuck in Jakarta, not permitted to travel. Thanks to some shot hesitancy in Australia, Java kept receiving these, but with limited time before they expires. I say shot hesitancy, but the main issue appears to have been negative marketing campaigns by the manufacturers of alternative shots. I eventually got to Java and eventually got shotted. You know what I mean. And with one that was accepted in the UK. Being Indonesia, this tied me to complex and difficult arrangements for any subsequent shots. This included having any further shots in Java and not Jakarta. That they had to be the same brand of shot and within a narrow window of time. This narrow window was ignored when the time actually came, as my required brand was shipped to Jakarta when the infections were reputedly soaring in the city. I say being Indonesia, but I understand from an expat friend in Bali that things were relatively simple there, with expats able to access what they needed via a private hospital. In fact, I was assisted in tracing suitable shots in Java by our former maid in Jakarta. She's a distant relative who lives above us on the mountain, where she returned after leaving us in Jakarta. I cannot be sure of her official status, but she seemed to be being paid to encourage and transport mountain dwellers to the shot centre, especially the old, who were particularly reluctant to walk for over an hour and back to get a shot against something that they'd never heard of. mentioning saurian infections in Jakarta. Briefly, the world's press claimed Jakarta to be the world epicentre of the health issue, and locally our neighbourhood was the nucleus of this epicentre. The local press was full of pictures of completely full cemeteries. But this was nothing new. They were already full before the crisis. Yes, we did hear of a few deaths, some very close to us. But from what I could see on the few times that I ventured out of the house, there were no corpses on the streets, nor were there any signs of the health crisis, save the authorities' response to the crisis. Later, Masperwa's daughter's new fiance's mother died, along with her sister, who'd been at school with Maddie, and a somewhat visitor to us both in Java and Jakarta. Later still, I befriended a young man from Jogja, Yogyakarta, who'd lost his mother. Maddie's hairdresser, whom she'd known since she was a young woman in Jakarta, despite her originally being from the same desa village in Gunung Kidul, and her husband, who'd built our new roof, were taken ill. We would drop off food parcels for them. They'd been unable to report for a long time. They'd been unable to work for a long time due to the restrictions, had been plunged into poverty. This led me to consider if Indonesia's deaths were more due to poverty and a woefully inadequate health service than directly due to health issues. Certainly, what I did conclude was that it was the poor who were being severely affected by the crisis, and people like myself were obliged to cover for the lack of social provision, whereas the rich in Indonesia have a reputation for tax avoidance, which could be a part of the reason for the woeful health service. Maddie's hairdresser and husband recovered slowly. However, since this instance, she's been plagued with strange illnesses and is currently in hospital with thrombosis. Of course, these could be related to the original health issue, but they're also related to the complications reported from the prophylactic. Although the most likely reason for her strange illness was climate change, or the amount of cash she'd been forced to handle when she owned a hairdresser's at Block M. Whatever the reason, it is keeping a once middle-class family in poverty, including unable to pay for their son's schooling. Thus, this health crisis has snatched the future from this young boy in a country where one's ability to earn a living is becoming increasingly restricted. Needless to say, we were asked to pay his school fees, and yet another example how with each crisis I'm expected to make good the lack of social provision in my adopted country, if for no other reason than it is my adopted country. The other somewhat strange observation was that there were no cases of the health issue in our desa in Java until people congregated to receive their shots. Also, whilst Widiati and Titi most certainly did become affected, and we believe Maddie did, I don't think I ever was. The uncertainty coming from Maddie and my reluctance to get tested, as if positive, including a false positive, led to even more draconian restrictions and an expensive regime of further testing. Given that for much of the outbreak we all lived together in the same house, even Maddie and I in the same bed, why was I unaffected? Well, there are three potential explanations. Firstly, my white skin meant that even with very limited exposure to the sun, I was getting more vitamin D than my family. Second, I remained unshotted due to the complications, much longer than the rest of my family. This meant that Widiati and Tiwi, even Maddie, did venture outside a lot more than I. And finally, I don't watch television. There was so much truth that was untruth, and if you clung on to the truth, even against the whole world. You are not mad. George Orwell from 1984. Not only was I unshotted longer than my family, this also meant that even once shotted, my status was deemed to be not fully shotted, as I'd have to wait 3 months, which, as I said, turned into 4 before I was fully shotted. What this also meant was that for over a year I was banned from shopping malls, including many supermarkets, government offices and public transport. The masjid, mosques, bars and restaurants were closed for this whole period. So effectively, for over a year I was housebound, as there are few public spaces in Indonesia. In any case, we needed to wear a mask to go anywhere, even on a beach, if allowed onto one, as many in Bali were closed to people with my status. This might also have meant that I was unable to travel to Bali or visit my mother. I could no longer get the paperwork to allow me to do so, nor indeed enter places like airports, except on a one-way ticket out. You might well be asking yourself, how was all this implemented and enforced? In a country with such a checkered history in impartial implementation and enforcement? Well, the solution was a health app that we had to download on our mobile phones and use to scan to enter any of the restricted buildings. This was policed by security guards found outside all large and public buildings in Indonesia, even when there is no apparent crisis. I say no apparent crisis, but for some years there have been ostensible terrorist bombings in Jakarta, so I guess this security isn't entirely random. The app included a traffic light system which showed our status, and mine is only partially shotted, and whilst I waited to be allowed the dubious pleasure of a second. Should you be tested, either through enforcement or voluntarily, the result was shown on the apps. So even a false positive meant that you had to quarantine until tested negative. And police were checking people's status on the street. And no, we did not have to wear a star on our outwear, but the app did establish digital ghettos. Furthermore, like the rest of the world, the health crisis was a wonderful opportunity for a hierarchy of minor officials to show just how important they were, adding their own authoritarian interpretations and measures to already draconian national restrictions. In short, anyone with a smidgen of power became drunk on it. There is a long tradition in Indonesia that there's no point in having power if you don't abuse it. During the health crisis, the west of the world learnt this from Indonesia, most notably the chief constable of the Derbyshire Constabulary. Police have dyed the normally bright blue waters of a beauty spot in Buxton black in a bid to deter people from gathering there, flouting government instructions to stay at home in a bid to slow down the, I don't think I can say this, so health issue we'll say, begins with a C, groups reportedly meeting at the disused quarry at Harbour Hill near Buxton, and that was reported by Sky News on the 28th of March 2020. Yes, the health crisis flushed out rudder spodes the world over, but rather than being identifiable by their black shorts, they hid behind international organisations and digital barriers. And no one has a contract phone, and all are on pay-as-you-go in Indonesia. But due to some wonderful foresights, some 3 years prior to the health issue, the government had insisted that we all register our mobile phones against our ID and family details. I'll bet they were relieved that this amazing foresight, as without it the app wouldn't have worked. I say worked, but like the registration process, it never worked very well. or at least not in doing what we'd been told it was intended for. And many people were restricted from activities they were fine to do, as there were bugs with the app. This led to people also carrying around their shot certificates, especially where I lived in Java, as few people own smartphones capable of downloading an app, and the phone signal is rarely that reliable to run such a power-hungry app. But then there are a few public buildings and malls, and indeed private security guards are rare in rural Java. The other wonderful feature of this app is that it's able to trace all your movements, not simply those places you've scanned into, and out of I should say, and everyone your mobile phone has come close to. So this enabled authorities to change the status of those who come close, those appeared suspicious in terms of their health status. Like so many digital services, they collect data without our express permission or knowledge, but maintain a facade of needing to agree to something spurious. This app was also mandatory to download for all those visiting Indonesia, and a massive effort was put into ensuring this at points of disembarkation. Although somewhat unpopular with the population and tourists, not least as the app was accessing so much data from one's phone and other apps, even when not in use, it drained people's batteries. The app was, however, hugely successful in preventing the health crisis, overpowering Indonesia's struggling health and social system. Yes, there were some deaths and some cases of the health problem, but nothing like what we'd been told to anticipate. What's more, the personal data the app collected provided valuable information to authorities, especially those ministers charged with its implementation, who were brilliantly managing the global implications. Indeed, such was its huge approval with authorities, it was showcased to world leaders at the Bali G20 conference as a template for future crisis. Almost as though those leaders at the G20 would be aware of advanced plans for future crises. Also showcased was Indonesia's massive security and surveillance efforts to ensure the safety of world leaders when visiting Bali, with its abundance of investment opportunities. Massive security and surveillance, which failed to find any evidence whatsoever in the murders of Chinese crypto millionaires, or at least allegedly Chinese crypto billionaires, Li Chiming and Cheng Jinan, at the Intercontinental Hotel in Jimbaran. Nothing of value appeared to have been taken from the room, apart from a Rolex, and it's claimed that there was no evidence of the murderer being present in the room. The Balinese authorities concluding that Lin Chiming had committed suicide. He was found castrated, although this was not mentioned in the autopsy, with over 20 shallow wounds all over his naked body, including on his back. The very same authorities had been so effective in deporting tourists for not wearing crash helmets. Despite another guest reporting suspicions, the employees failed to follow Intercontinental's emergency protocols regarding this report. Li's mother refused to visit Bali, being fearful for her own life, and nevertheless reports of this incident were sparse within Indonesia. However, there was much debate within China. The rather incongruous response from the Balinese authorities, causing Chinese tourism to the island to collapse, before it had really started again from China's health restrictions. Shortly after these murders, Bali banned payment in cryptocurrencies, although theoretically it was already illegal. Its illegality was simply reinforced, including, as you might have guessed, with threats of deportation. It was seen that Lee was a major trader and had been used Indonesia's lax enforcement on crypto rules to trade on the island, whilst at the same time the authorities were espousing a strategy to attract the super rich to Bali. Although Lee and Cheng were unmarried and sharing a room, and the central government had made very public noises about making this illegal. Although, of course, the app was only collecting data from Indonesia's urban middle class and foreign visitors, not the bulk of its population, who one assumes were as likely to be spreading the health issue or commit an act of terrorism against world leaders. Or maybe not. Rural dwellers were less likely to be in close contact with as many strangers, and probably less likely to be paying attention to the news. It was almost as if policy makers recognised that the health issue was discriminating against those who consumed expensive items imported from the West. Or could it be that these items were found to contain a health problem? The other reason for its unpopularity was the digital authoritarian assumed in the app's working. Most Indonesians are used to living under somewhat authoritarian restrictions, but the app was absolute. Thus, no sooner had new regulations been announced and total compliance was enforced by the app. So shop workers could overnight be unable to access their workplace, maybe even lose their jobs, not least as the shops were often in short supply, and making it impossible to become fully compliant overnight. But Indonesians are quite used to finding ways around such authoritarianism, and an industry developed providing assistance to those needing to escape the tyranny of the app. Some might call it cyberpunk, but such a definition would amuse Indonesians, for whom circumventing authority is a necessary way of life. As I indicated, my delay in accessing a suitable shot and an approved second was over a year. But by the time I actually got my second, the UK was accepting the Chinese shots. But I was locked into a specific shot in short supply in Java, where it had to be administered and within the window allocated. Effectively, I was imprisoned within my home during this time, especially when in Jakarta, where there was nowhere I could go anyway. When in Java they were more relaxed, and I developed a real dislike for Jakarta during this time, along with many other mild health issues. Maybe a part of the reason for my negative reactions was on reflection that this was not the first time I'd been imprisoned in Indonesia. When Maddie had lost her mind, we sought refuge in Gunung Kidul. I was somewhat forced to pay in her sister Bude and her husband Mas Predictor to help me into looking after Maddie. Certainly they overstayed their welcome, fleecing me out of my savings and exploiting Maddie's lack of clarity and good nature, constantly expecting Maddie to buy them gifts or give them old furnishings and electrical items for the house they were building in Banyumas. Why like a prison? Well, slowly Mas Predictor was dominating Maddie and I in our own home. A buddy would cook food in a Javanese fashion, adding sugar to everywhere, just as Mas Predictor liked it. I even found the food served in canteens when I took the night bus acceptable. I lost a lot of weight, but was unable to eat the food I was given, which was not unwelcome, but it also put me off Indonesian food, which previously I'd loved. A part of my newfound dislike for Jakarta came from the growing feeling of being unwelcome, which was exploited during the crisis. In part, this was because, like most countries, the health issue was blamed on foreigners. But Indonesians are particularly responsive to such rumours. I recall visiting a restaurant in Jogja and two middle-class families making a big point of washing their hands and seating as far as possible away from me, This increase in the feeling of being a target has only increased as Jakarta has become much more tribal and intolerant and shows no signs of abating. Perhaps a lunatic was simply a minority of one. George Orwell, 1984. I recently visited Ragunan Zoo in Jakarta, actually for my first time. I distinctly heard a lady of around my age saying to her family that I'd escaped from one of the cages. Yes, I've now grown a beard and maybe look somewhat wild, but the implication was that foreigners belonged in a zoo and not on the streets of Jakarta. Shocked though Western readers will be from reading this, let me assure my Indonesian readers will be saying, "What's the problem? She was only joking, being nice to you." I'm now very reluctant to leave my home, and my dislike for shopping malls has become almost a phobia, so that I now consume as little as possible. I somehow doubt that this was the predicted reaction to the app, although the growth in e-shopping may have been. I also avoid situations where I'm likely to be singled out, almost impossible as one of the few foreigners left outside Bali, or which will involve too much bureaucracy. This only added to the traumatisation I already felt from regular visits to Indonesian immigration. Maybe they're simply a product of my age, but I have no doubt that restrictions increase this severity. Although thinking about how my views of Jakarta have changed, Jakarta has become my prison, and how many ex-cons have fond memories of their jails. I guess a few do, but Indonesian prisons are hardly designed to engender this. During my weekly phone calls to my mother, I could feel her anguish, and not having seen me in what became 3 weeks. I too wanted to see her, as I'd not seen since my father had died, and whilst she had plenty of help, there were some administrative and financial issues I wanted to assist her with, as she'd relied on my father for these.